Welcome to Reroute Reflections, where we share our thoughts and insights about relationships, wellness, and business. We're your hosts, Becca and Andrew. We've been married for 10 years and have plenty of knowledge and experience in our relationships, the wellness industry, and the business world. Grab a coffee and let's chat.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Welcome to episode 14.
Yeah, this is going to be a banger.
As per usual.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that is the running theme, I think. This week's episode is a continuation from last week, where we talked about how do you establish your expertise in, for you, healthcare with your patients, and for me as a consultant with my clients, and also with project teams and with users. Like, for me, how do I get people to listen to what I have to say? And we talked about this idea of we have to bring them along a change journey with us. And we talked a little bit about frameworks. And so didn't have the time to talk about all of that.
Yeah.
So we're going to do that this week, and we're really excited to dive into some of the frameworks that you and I use on a day-to-day basis. And I think what I'd like to do is during this podcast is to talk through some of how I would apply some of those frameworks in helping address that problem of like, how do we get people to listen to us?
Yeah, it makes more sense that way at least for me, whenever I apply it to more real world situations, it's easier for me to understand it. Hopefully we can do the same for you.
Yeah, so we'll start with the weekly recap, what happened to us this week. So I'll start as per usual. This week was a pretty quiet week, I'd say, just trying to get myself back into the groove of things, coming off of my 2 weeks off camping and for us at the cottage. Really just trying to organize myself, get ready for some of what is to come. And yeah, just getting a lot of things in order, like accounting and some of my project stuff ready to go. So this week was actually pretty calm, which was actually nice. I'm doing a lot better of actually taking this time that's pretty quiet and actually not feeling so bad about it.
Not feeling the pressure to like do things.
Yeah, that exactly what I mean is, yeah, because I feel like I was so hard on myself for a while. And it was when I was talking with my accountant actually, where I was like, yeah, I don't know if this year is going to be as good as last year. And she's, oh, let's take a look. And we went through the books and she's, what are you talking about? You're still billing basically on par with where you were last year. Yeah. And I'm like, wow, maybe I just need to, it's just all in my head.
I think when you have a bad, like, few weeks or like a month that seems different than the previous months, then it gets in your head that like, oh, this whole year must be like terrible.
Yeah.
But like, we're already halfway through the year now. Yeah. And I think you forget like how much work you do most weeks compared to, I think May was just hard because you took 2 weeks off and then the 2 weeks that you did work were a little more quiet. So I think that got in your head a lot, but
yeah, I still billed great for May. You know, like my May numbers were great. And I do think summer might be a little bit light, but you know what? It's summer, right?
Yeah.
You know, so I deserve to take some time, and things will pick up in August, September, maybe not August, because that's when maybe August, because a lot of people take that time off, actually.
Yeah, true.
They were like, yo, you're a consultant, you can come in and help bridge the gap while everyone else is taking vacation. I'm like, so maybe August will be okay, but definitely September. Corporations tend to ramp up at the same time as like school. January.
Everyone gets back into their routines at September, right?
January, September. Because September is, we've been taking a lot of time off and enjoying the summer, and hey, we're couple of months away from year end and we need to get a lot of this shit done, and so they come back swinging in September. So that's what I expect. But yeah, pretty good week. How about you?
Yeah, I think in our last episode I had said that was my first week like back to work, which wasn't true because I worked the week before that too, but I think time's just going so fast. I think work's been really busy, and I think because you were away on your solo camping trip too, I had forgotten that like I had been going to work. I don't know. I think that week didn't exist to me without you here. So, yeah, work is going well. It's busy. I think, like you said, a lot of me and my colleagues are trying to figure out all our vacation time this summer, take off, and we got to make sure we still have coverage for our units and everything so that everyone is taken care of while we're away. Yeah.
Same old.
Yeah, it's still busy. One of my units, we're in a COVID outbreak right now. So as much as everyone wants to think that COVID is over, it still very much exists. We're all wearing our N95s now and having to take extra precautions around all of our patients and any visitors and things like that. So it's still there. It's still around. But yeah, we'll see.
Honestly.
Makes everything a little more hectic to deal with, but everybody is
Blast from
doing
the past.
okay. Yeah. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
honestly.
The other thing is on Monday, I have my convocation for my master's program. So that's pretty exciting. I am looking forward to it because the last time I went to a convocation was for my first undergrad in like 2011. And I had decided not to go to the convocation for my most recent undergraduate degree because A, it was all the way in London, which is quite a drive, and B, I was
It's 2 hours away.
I've been to an undergrad convocation before and they're just always so long, and I don't think it was something I like was super into celebrating. I think for me the master's degree was like the big goal ever since I went back to school. So it'll be nice to sum up all my years of school again and celebrate. We're gonna have a nice big family dinner after on Monday with everybody. But yeah, it'll be nice.
Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to it as well. Yeah, it'll be nice to see you graduate. I was
Officially.
like, I've been excited and constantly asking you like, when is it happening? And you got like a last minute notice around like all of the stuff.
Yeah,
right?
I think on the website it was saying like June 10th, but none of us had like officially gotten word of it. So we were like,
Right.
I think it's going to be in June, but we don't know for sure. And then finally, over the last maybe like 2 weeks, I think we finally got an email to be like, it's officially on this date. Here's the time. Here's where we have to show up. Like, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
And we
that's
were like,
wild.
oh, God, okay.
Yeah, that's wild because I remember with my experience, I had months notice. What if people are traveling or they're working outside of the area? Like 2 weeks is not enough time to book tickets, flights, and hotels and all that kind of stuff. So
Well, even to get work off.
Oh,
because
yeah,
it's on
true.
Monday at 3:30 in the afternoon. I'm very lucky that I can just go in and do a half day, set everything up in my unit for the day, and everything should be fine. But I can't imagine everyone is able to get work off or have
Yeah.
the luxury of being able to do a half day or something like that. Yeah, we'll see. But yeah, I'm excited for it.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So yeah, let's dive into today's topic. We talked a little bit about this. So we thought when we'll start by talking what is change management, just to set the foundation. Because there's a lot of times where I'll tell people. I think I usually introduce myself as like a business consultant. Because every time I introduce myself as a change management consultant, it's always wait, what? What are you talking about? What is that? So change management, and I pulled this definition off. Obviously, it's not coming straight off my head, and I actually think it nails it. So change management is a systematic approach that involves applying knowledge, tools, and resources to managing the human side of change to achieve the desired business outcomes. That includes strategies and activities for helping individuals, teams, and organizations transition from a current state, so what's happening today, to a desired future state or sometime in the future, minimizing resistance and maximizing engagement and adoption. Pretty bang on. That's exactly what I do for a living.
A good summary.
Yeah. So we thought maybe we'll start by talking about in this realm of like change management. I know the key topic for discussion today is going to be around like how do we get people to listen to our expertise, but just in general from like an overall business and healthcare setting, what are some of the challenges that either you're facing now from a change management perspective or have faced in the past?
I think probably the number one thing is that not everyone is always ready for change, despite whatever health challenges they're going through. It can be difficult for some people to be ready for change depending on their socioeconomic status, their support systems, family, friend situation, their health condition itself, and even just like physical, mental abilities. Like there's so much that goes into someone being more ready for change versus someone else. And I think especially working in a hospital, it's easy for patients to say yes in the moment to here's my recommendations, here's the diet education I'm going to give you, and they're like, yeah, this sounds great, no worries, I can definitely do that. But once they go home, they have to implement those changes or figure out how to navigate it, and it's not always that easy. And I think part of the problem between the healthcare system and having someone leave is that we don't always have the chance to follow up with them and monitor them once they're out of the hospital. Once they're out of the hospital, they're off my caseload. We're very lucky that we do have outpatient dietitians in our cancer center. So sometimes if I have really high risk patients, I'll flag them to an outpatient dietitian, say, hey, you should follow up with this person in a couple weeks, make sure they're doing okay. If they're not willing to talk with that dietitian as an outpatient, or if they're not able to be contacted, or if they're not high risk and it's up to them to reach out to a dietitian again to get support, like that doesn't always happen. It can be hard for people to sustain changes once they leave. But yeah, I definitely think the biggest thing is just people being ready for change.
Yeah. I would say that's really difficult, because one of the key things around managing change successfully, in my opinion, is constant monitoring before and after. And if those lines of communication for feedback and stuff are cut off, it makes it really hard to know whether people need additional support, or and if they do, how do you get to them? Yeah, so if you hear a little bit of purring or something, that's a little Arwen, and we never let Arwen leave when she's petting or she's so in a cuddly mood right now, because it's very rare. So
she's like bumping up on the microphone. She's got her face right in it. Like,
so we're just gonna let it happen, because she's super cute. So I think overall, if I were to talk about some of the challenges as to like why people tend to like not listen to my advice or feedback, or just in general around change, I think I've talked about it 1,000 times already. It's resourcing primarily, I think, for change management. I did say that the golden rule, I guess, is around 10% of a project. The project cost should be allocated to change management. I'm really lucky if I get anywhere near that. There are some projects where it's like 1%, or closer to 2%, nowhere near that point, which makes it really difficult. And so when you have limited resources, you're unable to do a lot of the activities and strategies that you would want to do in order to manage change successfully, because you just don't have enough people who are able to do it. And so that is a really big deterrent, or not deterrent, really big challenge and barrier for me.
Which I think is the same for us, having that outpatient support. Like, we just don't have the funds or the resources to follow up with all these people leaving. So it's
exactly.
very similar.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big problem. And until we get the resources, it's really going to be hard for us to manage or actually prove the value of change management. You can't say, like change doesn't work if you're allocating 1% of your budget to change. Just give us a chance.
And you're never following through to see how it turned out.
Yeah, because you're basically allowing us to do 10% of what we could do. If you think about 10% being the standard, and you're giving us 1% of the budget, then that means we can only do 10% of what we should be doing. That's an easy way to think about it, and hopefully that resonates with some people. I think the other piece around why I get a lot of resistance is because when people think of change management, they really think of it being common sense, So it's, do we even need change management? Like, a lot of this stuff is common sense, or this change is a slam dunk. This is word for word what I've heard from people, which is really funny now, because those same individuals who told me at the beginning of a project that this is going to be a slam dunk are now like coming back to me being like, we've, not managed expectations properly, blah, 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 blah. And so it's every time I hear that, my alarm bells go off, because I'm like, this is actually going to be a much more challenging change, because you've got people who are underestimating how difficult and complex change of any type is. Yes. And when people are like, oh, this is a slam dunk, it just means they're just not going to listen to me, because they think it's just easy. It's just like common sense. We're moving from this system to this old system to this new system. People just figure it out. And they're like, it's not that complicated. It's like more user friendly. So obviously people are going to be able to use it without a problem. And that's what I heard a lot of in one of my current projects. And now they're eating their words because of it. And
I think it's similar where people are in hospital, you're giving them like your recommendations to go home and follow some like diet restrictions for even just a few weeks, and then you can go back to your regular diet, and they're like, yeah, that's okay. That sounds pretty easy, like relatively common sense. But again, it's once you get home and you open your fridge and you're like, oh, what am I going to eat? I'm supposed to be following like a low fiber diet. Is this fiber? Like, and it's a lot more complex once you actually get into it. And I think a lot of people underestimate it, but if you've ever tried to make a health behavior change yourself, I think you understand that it's not that simple. And
No.
it applies, especially on a bigger scale like with you in business.
Mhm.
It's even more tough to get all of those people on board with a specific change.
Yeah, because the change always happens at the individual level. And so the complexity that you think of from an individual to change their behavior, it doesn't get any easier if you multiply that by 100, 1,000, 10,000 people. It gets that much more complicated, right? Because each individual has their own desires. They're motivated by different things.
Their own knowledge, their own experience of how things have gone.
And the way they'll perceive communications are going to be different. And so it makes it even more complex. And why the larger the change, the more resources we need in order to make sure that we can go out with customized messaging. We can understand what motivates the people, or at least most people. But without the resources, you're not able to do those due diligence. And so of course the change isn't going to be successful. And so you got to give change management a chance, right? And I don't think change management by and large has been given enough resources in order to know one way or another whether change management is actually an effective practice or not.
Right.
Like we never get the resourcing that we need to be successful.
Yeah.
And so you can't make a decision as to whether change management was a success or not in a project where you're dealing with 1% budget allocations to you. If we see any value whatsoever when you've given us only 1%,
that's amazing.
That's amazing.
If anything, that should show how valuable it is, because even with only 1%, if you're seeing like an improved change, imagine what it could have been if you had fully given like a 10% budget.
Exactly. It's hard to show because no two changes are the same. So you can't say, oh, this one project that we didn't have change management, we saw our ability to achieve our objectives was 90%, and now we have change management in this other project that may be similar, and now we're at 110% of our objectives. But no two changes are the same. It's really hard to isolate that it was change management that actually helped. Mm-hmm. The only way that you can determine whether change management was effective in my book is to, and why I always do this, is establish those key performance metrics around what would be effective in terms of change management. Start tracking them pre-pilot, during pilot, and then doing the same thing for national and seeing whether you see an uptick one way or another. But you do need to identify what are those change management metrics just to understand whether you're seeing that value that you want. And the ultimate assessment is, do you achieve your benefits or not that you look out for? But how many businesses do that? I've never seen one. So, but we can go into soapbox forever on that one. And then the last piece, just around why I feel like my expertise sometimes isn't listened to in general, is just around the sponsor. So whoever, usually the executive sponsor, so somebody who is basically signed off on the project and is, managing it or leading it from an executive level. If he or she is involved in the project and very active and also a supporter of change management and the importance of it, that really helps in ensuring that the advice I provide is actually listened to and followed. But a lot of the times the sponsor does not show up as often, isn't as active, and isn't as active in terms of meeting participation, but also not an active supporter of change management as a practice. And so that can really affect whether people are going to listen to me. I'm external, after all. I'm coming in as the expert, especially when the sponsor is the one who hires me. You would expect that individual would provide that
some support and backing,
and be like, you got to listen to him. He's the expert.
We hired him for a reason.
Exactly. And if that person isn't doing that consistently, it makes it really difficult for people to listen to what I have to say. So, resources, this whole notion or this myth that change management is common sense, and inactive sponsors really affect, I think, how I'm perceived and whether they'll listen to my advice or not.
Yeah.
So I think those are great challenges. Let's talk about the frameworks, because that was a big kind of element of today's conversation.
Yes.
So why don't you start with some of the frameworks? And I'm really interested in hearing this because I know nothing about the frameworks applicable to changing patient behavior.
Yeah, there's definitely, I was going through some of my old school notes about learning about all the different models of change that we can implement for health behavior, and there's so many. But I think one that I had mentioned last week, and I think it's one of the easier ones to grasp, and I think for me it is like the most applicable in what I do every day, is the trans theoretical model, or the stages of change. So this one is essentially 6 steps. It can be seen as 6 linear steps, but I think it's important to note with it that it's not necessarily a straight line. Like, you can go back and forth between different stages. Yeah, whether you're advancing or you're seeing some struggles, I think it just depends on the person. And I think with that as well, it can be challenging to figure out where somebody is at in this model or in their stages of change. But I figure we'll go through them together and just get like a high overview of what each stage means. And so the first one is pre-contemplation. So this is when someone has no awareness of a change, no intent to change behaviors. Everything for them seems to be going fine. There's no reason for them to change anything. Then you've got the contemplation stage. So maybe now they're starting to become more aware of, oh, maybe I do need to change my diet a little bit. Like, maybe I haven't been eating so healthy, but they're not quite ready to actually commit to any action yet. It's just in the back of their mind, they're starting to think this over. Then comes the preparation stage. So now they're like, all right, I definitely need to make this change happen. I'm ready to commit to something and kind of follow through with what needs to happen. This is typically where I might come in to start supporting them as a dietitian, where we might start planning things together to say, let's talk about what you've been thinking about changing, like the why behind it, and we can come up with some like small actionable steps together to get you to that goal. Mm-hmm. The 4th step would be action, which kind of common sense. This is when they actually implement the changes and start working towards those goals. So this would be after our initial assessment. Now you go out into the world back home and you have to start actually implementing what we talked about on your own. Mm-hmm. The 5th step is just the maintenance phase. So here you're trying to prevent setbacks or like a relapse in your change. This might, again, be where we have a follow-up appointment together to say what's been working for you, what isn't working, like how do we maintain this the way it is and help you further your action towards your goal. So maybe add in some new habits or tweak your goal a little bit and go from there. And the last stage is relapse. So unfortunately, I think the way this is positioned too is that this is usually a rule that it will almost always happen, rather than being an exception. I think people underestimate, like you said, how hard changes can be, and especially with individual health behaviors, relapse is almost always going to happen. But that's okay. And that's why this stages of change model is not linear, because now we go back and say, all right, let's either go back to the maintenance phase and reassess things, or maybe we need to start all over because this is just not going to work for you and we need to figure something entirely different out together. So let's go back to preparation and start again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, like, this relapse can also happen at any point in these stages of change. So even immediately after preparation, we had a full conversation. You're like, yeah, I'm going to go home and do this. Maybe you're not able to implement anything. We're like, okay, great. Let's come back to preparation. Let's start again. Let's do this all together. Yeah, that's the kind of brief overview of those 6 steps of the stages of change, or the trans theoretical model. And I think this is the one that I use the most in my practice, at least.
Yeah, I like the concept of, or the like acknowledgement that while this appears to be linear, it's not meant to be followed step by step. And there are instances where people will go back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And as we dive into some of the business change models, you'll notice like some of the main criticisms for some of them is that they've been established and communicated as linear models.
Right.
And change doesn't happen linearly. No. It's very dynamic. And so the fact that this already captures it is really important. I also like the action phase. I thought that was like really important. Sorry, the preparation phase and the action phase. Like, right. The preparation phase is like you're establishing a plan for the patient in order to actually do what it is he or she needs to do.
Yeah.
And I thought that's really good. And one element that sometimes is lacking when it comes to managing change from an organization standpoint, like there is a plan around how are we going to launch a change, but an actual explicit plan around how do we get an individual to move. That's a piece that I think is at least opened my eyes up. Like, of course, we have training plans and all of that stuff. That's very broad. Like, I'm talking at an individual level, communicating to leaders, for example, around like some of the things that they need to look for in order to help ensure each of their employees are on the path to success based on their individual needs. Like, how do they like to learn? Or are they hands-on? Are they more visual? Do they need guides and resources? And creating some type of customized plan for each of the employees is not something that we're ever resourced to do, because leaders typically have a ton of other things on their plate. But it definitely got me thinking, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's where like one of my biggest struggles comes in as a dietitian working in a hospital is oftentimes if I'm just seeing someone once or twice and they've had a relatively non-complicated surgery, they're ready to go home after only a couple of days, and I'm just going to give them a quick education, give them some tips, and they're out the door. Like, I'm able to get in with that preparation phase to help them plan it out and say, here's what you need to do, here's my recommendations. Maybe we can talk about a little bit of like, how do you make this realistic at home? But the action phase actually comes when they're discharged and when they go home and now they have to implement it. So I'm only even seeing them for one piece of the next 4 steps that needs to happen for them. So I think that's where that struggle comes from. But at the same time, I am also very lucky in that many patients who unfortunately are staying for a prolonged amount of time, I am able to go through those steps with them of preparation, action, maintenance. If I have to implement different nutrition support things for them, then I can see that happen for them. But it's always a piece of them going home and maintaining things or taking action that can be very hard. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So from change management, I guess from an organization perspective, there definitely is a lot of synergy between what you've already talked about and what I'm probably going to share. You should know by now, just based off of my comments in the past, that the way that I approach managing change is not based on any one framework. I use multiple frameworks that exist in order to help establish the approach that I want to take for any given change. When I implement, the frameworks vary, whether it's at the beginning stages, at the pilot stage, or when we're preparing for launch. And I'll cherry pick elements from as many frameworks that resonate with me as possible. And probably now the new framework from you, I can't even remember the name of it. The trans-theoretical or stages of change, yeah.
Whichever is easier to remember.
Definitely stages of change.
Yeah. But that's important for you to pick and choose from a whole bunch of different models, because you're dealing with such large-scale transformations and large-scale changes that I think for you to really speak to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, you need to figure out what's right for, kind of like we said, like the most people. And I think that involves taking from several models.
Yeah, and I think the benefit, there are some here that are really focused on like corporate changes, but in essence, any of these models should be able to be applied personally as well to yourself. And I have applied some of these personally to myself when I'm trying to manage my own changes with success. And here are the 3 models that I'm going to talk about that I use almost all the time. ADKAR, for sure. So that's the ProSci model. ADKAR is 5 building blocks for change. ADKAR is an acronym. So each of those letters represent a part of, or the element of that model. It is a linear model, but as I mentioned, change does not happen linearly. And so while it's designed to flow from A, D, K, A, and then R, know that people will go back and forth throughout the model. So ADKAR is the first one we'll talk about. The other one that I use pretty much religiously at the beginning of a change is the McKinsey 7S model. So that one's very corporate focused, so applying it to a personal change may be a little bit difficult, but I still think there's ways to do it. It's not meant for like a personal change. Right. Whereas ADKAR you can definitely use for both. And then Kotter's 8-step change model is also something that I value pieces of. And so I leverage a lot of these 3 models in all of my changes. And definitely I can see leveraging them in helping me overcome some of this resistance that I'm getting in terms of sharing my expertise with folks. So the ADKAR model, so ADKAR, like I said, is an acronym. It represents what they call the 5 building blocks of change. So you need all 5 in order to actually have a successful change. So that's awareness, that's the A, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. The idea of this model, which really resonates with me, is about the idea of moving each and every individual individually through the change. So from where they are today, you're moving them to where they need to be tomorrow in terms of the behavior they're doing now to what they need to do in the future. If done correctly, the idea is that every individual within that organization is going to move from the future state from the current state to the future state. And you'll get overall alignment. And when you get that alignment, that's when you realize the benefits of the change. And it makes a lot of sense. For you to realize 100% of your expected benefits or of your objectives for a project, that's assuming that everyone's doing what you want them to do differently in the future. If 10, 100, 1,000 people are not doing it, and you have an organization that's 10,000 people, that means at most you'll get 90% of your expected benefit. Right? Because you've got 10% of your organization that's not doing it. And so in theory, it all makes sense, right? And that's the idea. And they also say when you get into a future state that has people that aren't with you, you get what they call a Swiss cheese future state because you got a bunch of holes in like that future state picture. So if we start with the top, so if we start with awareness, creating awareness actually means communicating the need for change effectively. But more importantly than just communicating why this change is necessary, it's about communicating why it's necessary right now. And that's something that's always missed. And if you think about this personally, that's what gets a lot of people held up. If you want to stop smoking, for example, it's not about like why, not only telling people, why do you need to stop smoking? Everyone knows that. It's like, why do I need to stop now?
Right.
That's the piece that I think always people are missing. Because if you're young, you're in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, and you're still smoking a little bit here and there, you're like, yeah, I know smoking's bad for me, but like, why do I need to change now?
I'll stop. Healthy.
Yeah, I'll stop in 10 years, 5 years, next year, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the key piece because everyone always misses that. So that element of awareness is really important. Desire is the next building block. So once you're aware of the change, now you need to be motivated, encouraged to actually support the change, not just motivated about what's happening and what's changing, but you need to be motivated to actually support what you need to do for that change to be realized. Because a lot of people are like, yeah, like AI is great. I'd love to integrate it. But are you actually willing to do what you need to do in order to integrate that into your day-to-day? That's the difference.
Right. Invest in the programming that's needed and the technology support and the extra people. And
extra training that you may need to do, the training for yourself, training for your team, changing processes, policies. Are you actually motivated to do all these things? Like what's in it for you sort of thing and what's in it for the organization? Are you actually buying into all that? And that's a key piece. And that's the piece that we tend to see a lot of struggle.
Right.
Because it's motivating people is hard and it's a very individual thing. And so how you motivate one person versus another is very different. You hope that there's alignment in terms of there's some motivation that aligns with most people so that you can just focus on that. But in my experience, it's very rare.
And I think if you were to go back to the smoking example too, like we said, most people are aware of why they should be changing, why they need to stop smoking. Most people probably even know why they should do it now because they're trying to prevent them of developing cancer or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's that desire, I think, that holds them back because they don't have that strong desire because the smoking feels so much better than not smoking, right?
Exactly.
And not to skip ahead, but I think tying into your next step, which would be knowledge, most people know how to try and stop with nicotine patches or gum or whatever. They know how and they know why, but it's that desire that's always missing for them.
For sure.
For the most part.
Yeah, knowledge, like you said, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's like learning about how to change. And that's the piece that it's not often missed from the standpoint of the end user when it comes to change, but it almost always is missed when it comes to the project team. Because the project team is undergoing a change as well in a lot of cases, especially if change management is a new concept. Making sure that people within the project understand what the value of change management is really important for everything else to follow. And I think that's the key piece around change management that I think we oftentimes miss, is that we're so focused on the end user, the employee, that we oftentimes miss the project, and we also miss the customer. Those are the two pieces that we're often missing, because we tend to leave the customer to marketing. And it's, yes, but they're undergoing a change potentially as well.
Yeah.
And so we can't miss the end customer as well. Ability kind of goes hand in hand with knowledge. There is tend to always be this gap where, we train people up. We've gone them through the training sessions, but at the end of the day, they still don't understand what to do. And that's the ability. It's like golfing, right? You can learn, like, you know how to, if you've trained in golf, you know how to hit the ball. Like, you understand how to do it.
Yeah,
but,
you might know, like, the theory behind it really.
Yeah, I get it. I know where my hands need to be. I know how I need to swing. I know all the mechanics.
Right.
But when it comes to actually doing it, I can never do it.
Right.
And that's really true in my case. And that's the difference between knowledge and ability.
Yes.
And so sometimes we forget that we can't just train people. We need to make sure that they actually know what needs to be done and can do it. Because if you can't do it, you won't realize the benefits.
Right.
That's the key.
And I think that's a big one that holds back my patients a lot, because I can give them the knowledge and help create that awareness, and maybe they have the desire to change, but if they go home and they're not the one in their home who cooks or does the shopping or anything like this, and they don't have the funds to get the foods that they need to get better, then their ability is the part that's lacking here. And so it's trying to then figure out with them, what can we do to get around this to help make you more able to make the changes that need to make?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the last one, which is really similar to, I think, what was it, relapse? No, maintenance, I think, was really similar to maintenance, is this idea of reinforcement, which is really just what you're doing to make sure the change sticks. I think one of the common misconceptions I get is we're guaranteed to realize the benefits of a change when the change is a requirement. So, for example, you're moving to a new system and the old system is being sunset. People will always tell me, like, we don't need to track adoption or anything like that because it's 100%. It's going to be 100% adopted.
They're going to be forced to do it because the other system will literally be shut down.
And I'm like, I agree with you. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that we don't have other change metrics that we need to track, like proficiency in the system. Because at the end of the day, it's, you can all be using the system, but if it takes you 10 times as long in order to do the same task that you were doing before, then it doesn't matter that you've got a fancy new $10 million system. The change was pretty unsuccessful because you were unable to either build the knowledge that they needed effectively in order to give them the ability to implement the change successfully on day one, or you just trained them up and had no indication of whether they had any essence of the ability to actually do it. And by the time you've launched it, it's too late. And so there is that piece. And unfortunately, reinforcement tends to be the first thing that goes when it comes to managing a change. It's very rare that you have support for the change management team to be involved post-launch of a change.
Right, and that maintenance part of it.
And that's the part where literally, and what is so ironic about the whole thing is that's literally when the change manager should be the most busy, is after the launch. Because before that, you don't know anything. You don't know anything about what's going to happen in the change until it happens.
Yeah.
Because you can theorize, and like, how many times have you tried to fortune tell like what's going to happen in your future and you've been wrong? For me, it happens all the time. Think about that at 1,000, 10,000 scale of individuals where you're basically before launch trying to fortune tell what these people are going to do. And now the change happens and you're like, all right,
all done,
all
bye.
packed up, moving on to the next one. Whoa, this is where rubber meets the road. This is where we get a chance to see whether our theories were accurate.
Right.
And now you're telling me to leave? Are you kidding me? This is when I need to be involved. I need to monitor to see, are people doing what I thought they were going to be doing? And if so, great. If not, we need to introduce new training, introduce enhancements to the system to make things that we thought would be easier. Or if there's a process flow that's failing, we need to adjust that.
Give them more tools, more resources
and we
to
need,
help support it.
We need the resources, the people to be allocated to making those changes quickly. You can't launch a system and then remove all the resources. So now if an issue arises around a broken flow or a broken workflow, you now have to go through like a business as usual process that's going to take months in order to fix. Mm-hmm. It's like, this thing just happened. If it takes months for you to fix something that's, critical, you're going to lose a lot of buy-in. People are going to revolt. And that's why I also value pilots, because it's much more likely for me to get a pilot in than for me to stick around 6 months post-launch.
Right. You get the pilot in earlier in the change planning.
Yeah, so you get a chance to stress test some initial theories, to be like, okay, I think people are going to do this when we launch it. And we get a pilot to say, did they? Yes, great. Oftentimes, or literally all the time, they never do what we expect. And so then we have to adjust it, and we hope and pray that when we launch it, they actually do what happened in pilot and not something different. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you, spoiler alert, they always do something different. Yeah. And so at least the pilot gets us closer, though. But we need both. We need a pilot, and we need also support to make sure that change sticks. So that's the ADKAR model. And I'll go through the other two, rather quickly, because obviously I could probably do a whole training session on this.
One, yeah.
But the McKinsey 7S model is something that I typically do right at the beginning. It's essentially talking about 7 interdependent elements. So all of them are interconnected and they all feed into each other. And so it's strategy, structure, system, shared values, skills, style, and staff. So all S's, that's where the 7S comes from. So they're all interrelated factors that influence how an organization's able to change. If you look at all of the 7 elements, you need to see alignment. So around, what is your strategy? Do you have the structure in place in order to support this new strategy? Mm-hmm. Are the systems that we need, so the processes and policies and procedures that support your daily operations, are they going to be updated and changed in a way that supports that strategy, which then also supports that structure? Are we achieving shared values? So are the core beliefs and attitudes that shapes the organization culture, will they adjust in order to ensure that we're all moving in the right directions? Are we building the skills, so the capabilities that employees need in order to actually execute the strategy? Style refers to leadership and culture as well. So do we have the right leadership in place? Do they have the right structures in place in order to make sure that we can have supportive and flexible leadership, gathering the feedback that we need, that sort of thing? And then lastly is the staff. So is essentially, do we have the right people in the right place at the right time for when this strategy goes? It's very hard. It's a very theoretical model. So I'll give an example of something that we actually had talked about before, which is the 4-day work week.
Oh, yeah.
So if you were to like implement a 4-day work week, so moving to a 4-day work week from a 5-day work week, your strategy would focus on, let's say, something like improving employee work-life balance and productivity while maintaining or increasing overall business performance. That's your strategy. If we talk about structure, this might mean restructuring the teams to ensure that all the critical functions are covered, even though we're moving our work from 5 days to 4. Right. So the structure of the organization will need to change. And this might even include redefining roles and responsibilities, creating overlapping shifts, these types of things. Mm-hmm. From a system standpoint, this would mean, okay, we need to make sure that we're implementing new project management systems and communication tools to help maintain productivity while we're in a reduced work week. Mm-hmm. If a client calls in when we're off, how do they get
talk
right?
With someone, yeah.
Are we introducing like an AI chatbot, for example, in order to service like 80-90% of customer questions when no one's in the office? Things like that. And then shared values. So if we're trying to promote this 4-day work week, this is like a cultural change. So we need to work on adapting our culture. Hopefully there is already alignment with it. Maybe your culture is one that values work-life balance. And so this is already aligned with what your culture is. We are a company that values work-life balance. And so it should be no surprise to anybody that we're looking at adopting a 4-day work week. So you have alignment there, which would be key. I can't imagine an organization that didn't have that wanting to do this. So
Right.
you probably already have that alignment there. Skills, though, this would involve training employees in time management and prioritization. How do you know? Because like at the end of the day, as we talked about in our 4-day work week episode, it's this idea of you're now having to find ways to not improve productivity
You
of
have to
your
do the
overall
same
business.
amount of work, but
Yeah.
now with 1 day less.
So if you're not a productive organization, you need to become productive, and that's where this skill comes in.
Yeah.
From a style perspective, you're needing to then adopt like a flexible leadership style that encourages feedback and to allow this transition to happen seamlessly without losing sight of potential resistors. Because there may be people that resist the change. It seems like a slam dunk, quote unquote, change. And that's where things get in my experience, that's literally the most risky change.
Yeah.
Because people think it's easy and it never is.
No.
And it doesn't matter how obvious and how straightforward it sounds, it never is. I promise you that. And the difference between an organization that sees a change as highly complex and a change that they think is a slam dunk is that at least the complex organization is expecting the worst.
Yeah.
You know?
And then they're
That's
planning
the biggest
for the
problem.
worst. And then
Yeah.
maybe it ends up being a slam dunk for them and seems easy because they've done all the necessary planning and
Exactly.
implementation that got them there.
Exactly. And then staff is the last one, and this is a big one. And so you can see staff, so let me finish it. This is ensuring that the organization has like the dedicated team to manage the transition, not just like the staff, but also the project team that is
Right.
staffed properly. You've got 10% of your budget allocated to change management. These types of things are really important to help sure that employees can transition to this change successfully. And so you can see how maybe you weren't thinking about all of those things. And you can see why I do this at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because if you were to do this midway through, once key decisions are made, you may find that there are gaps in this model that you can't
Some key
address.
steps, yeah.
But if you do this at the beginning, you can establish what is your overall strategy. Okay, what does that mean in terms of what are the system changes that we need to do? What are the staffing changes? What skills do we need to build in? And once you have that, you almost have a blueprint of what needs to change in order for this strategy to be successful.
Yeah.
And then once you have that strategy, you start to execute all of those things. And once you get to the point, it's like starting to check in to say, okay, from an ADKAR model perspective, are we getting the awareness that we need? Are we building the desire? And so all of these kind of frameworks I weave in together. And I
Right.
use not just one or the other. I use both of them because I see both of them as being incredibly valuable for very different times during the change journey.
Yeah, it sounds like this one here, the McKinsey 7S model, helps you prioritize what changes need to happen first over other ones. Because like you said, if the shared values is already aligned with the change that they're trying to make, then it's going to be lower on your priority list in terms of needing to monitor it and make sure things happen. But if you come in and you do your evaluation and figure out of the 7 S's, you really need to focus on the strategy here for somebody. That's going to be your top priority to say, if I only have 1% of a 10% budget, we need to focus on this one more so than the shared values, because it seems like that one's most aligned with what we need to happen so far.
Yeah, and it also during this part it identifies gaps in the overall like project where maybe people weren't thinking about the skills that needed to be built up, where they weren't thinking about primarily the style. That's usually the one where they don't think about the change that needs to happen from a leadership standpoint in order to help support this change, because you're moving from a structured 5-day per week model that every leader is very accustomed to now a 4-day. And how is a leader supposed to lead in this new model? Sounds simple, but it's not, right? Because now they're having to crunch not only their day-to-day work, but also all of their one-on-one conversations, coaching, all that stuff into a 4-day work week. That can be very stressful. And how do you ensure that the style of leadership and the framework for how you lead in that organization it becomes more flexible in order to not overwhelm your leaders. So there's all these things. So a lot of it is just more of a, hey, have we thought of everything? No? Okay, let's make sure that we also think that this project is going to have to address all of these other elements that we haven't even thought about yet. And so it's a really good gut check at the beginning, which is why I like it. And one of the things that I like to do with all of my frameworks is not only just identify like what are the elements that need to change, but also what happens if we don't change it? What if we're not successful in building the right structure? So if our structure is restructuring teams and roles to ensure critical functions are covered within the reduced work schedule, if we don't do that, then inefficiencies and gaps in coverage will happen, which will potentially lead in business interruption. And so when you say it like that, people are like, oh yeah, that's 100% true. We need to focus on that. And so sometimes when you talk about like, well, if we do nothing, which most people kind of will go straight to like, whoa, you know, like it doesn't seem that big of a deal, right? Restructuring teams and roles to ensure critical functions are covered doesn't seem all that. Right. But when you say, hey, if you don't do that, you're going to have business interruption. They're like, all right, we got to focus on that. And so sometimes it's all about reframing or framing it in the right way. That is important. Lastly, Kotter's 8-step model. So I'll just go through the 8 steps. And these are the steps to launching a successful change. Like these are the things that you need to have in place. Establishing a sense of urgency. It's that element of like, why now thing. Forming a powerful guiding coalition. So this is this idea of getting rallying support. So this could be through your change agent network. This could be through sponsorships. This could be through senior leaders and so on. But you need this coalition to help, and ideally employees and actual users to help push a change forward. Developing a vision and strategy for the change, which is something that doesn't ever happen, but something that I typically will always do is establish what I call a change story. That is like a one-pager that in the old days would be printed out and stuck onto your desk, but nowadays it's probably just your desktop icon or whatever, or your desktop background. That's it. Communicating the vision, so that's communicating the change story in my case. Empowering employees, which is a really important step to make sure that they are able to launch a change successfully. This next one is something that is why I like the model, is generating short-term wins, so quick wins. And that just builds momentum up. It's, if you're launching a change that's going to happen 2 years down the road, it's really important that within those 2 years, you're building some quick wins in so that people can actually see that, hey, this is moving us in the right direction. A lot of the times, everyone always approaches changes like a big bang thing. It's like, we got to do all of this stuff on launch date. So why not phase it out? Not only will this help with the capacity for change and not overwhelming people, but this will also allow people to see little bits of the benefits over time. And so I'm a huge fan of phased rollouts, because then they're like individual mini pilots almost.
Yep.
And so that I am always a big fan of.
And that's a huge one as well with health behavior, is generating those short-term wins for someone, because everyone always comes in with this big goal of, I want to lose 50 pounds. And you're like, okay, that's probably not going to happen healthily in the next year, maybe 2 years, but let's figure out some short-term ways to get us there and really understand the why you want to do this so that we can come up with those short-term wins for you. Do you want to be able to climb like all the stairs at work to your 4th floor office? Do you want to be able to run around with your grandchildren more and not get out of breath? Let's focus on those little short-term wins that we can see happen in the next couple of months. And maybe a year, 2 years down the line, you'll see that big goal of losing weight come to fruition because you've broken it down into smaller, more digestible chunks.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think that it's hard to be motivated by something that's in the future.
So big. Yeah,
right?
This way gives everyone like those little bits of hope, right?
That's
I'm actually seeing progress.
Yeah.
Like things are actually working.
Yeah, it's one of the main reasons why it's one of the elements that I take from the Kotter model, because I think it's incredibly important. And then the idea of a powerful guiding coalition is also, and that too, but also the developing a vision and strategy, like communicating that vision to everybody through what I call the change story, and many call the change story, is I think incredibly powerful, because a lot of the times people are like, wait, what's happening? Yeah. What are we doing?
Why are we doing that?
And so having that, I usually post it on like the intranet page, so the internal website for the company, right. Whatever portal page that we have for the project, I'll have kind of the elements of like, why are we changing? what's the vision, what are the benefits that we're hoping to achieve, and plaster it right there so that everyone knows this is what we're doing and why. So I think those pieces are incredibly important. And there's other elements, but I'll link all the stuff in the show notes so that people, if they want to see it. But yeah, those are the three main models that I use to change. So now let's talk about how are we going to apply some of these frameworks to help us ensure that our expertise is listened to in our respective fields.
I think I touched on it a little bit as I was going through the framework that I had shared. But I think for me, like during an initial assessment with someone, kind of building that rapport, building that trust, learning more about them and how they are outside of their hospital admission, for example. So what were you eating before? Who does your grocery shopping? Let's talk about those things. Usually that's when I can start to get an idea of where someone is in terms of those stages of change. And of course, no matter like what part of that model they're in, I'll always try to do my part with providing my recommendations or the necessary education that they might need before they leave. But if I do come across people who are really pushing back and really not ready and they're in that pre-contemplative state, didn't even think they have to change anything, then for me, I know it's not specifically worth my time or my energy to try and convince them otherwise. If I know they're just going to go home and do what they want, then why am I going to spend an extra 15 minutes with them when I could squeeze in an extra patient instead who might really want my valuable advice? Yeah, so often in my documentation, I'll kind of make note of that because I think we talked about that in last week's episode of how important documentation is to say, here's what I did with the patient. They were really receptive. They understood. They accepted the plan. They really wanted to be on board with this. Or if I have someone who's really pushing back, then I'll make a brief note to say the patient was not receptive to my visit today. I provided them with the handouts, the necessary education, but ultimately it's up to them. I think in terms of having a framework like this in mind, it can really help establish your credibility in your documentation or in when you're speaking with your other team members, because you're using like evidence-based information. Like we know these models have been tested and have come up as a theory to follow because of their success in very different situations. And I think it's a much more professional way to say, based on my assessment, the patient was observed to be in a pre-contemplative stage of change and not ready for intervention. So already provided handout and ended the conversation. Instead of saying like they're grumpy, they don't want to listen, it's not worth my time.
Yeah,
you know
exactly.
what I mean? It's much more professional to say it in that way, and it helps establish that expertise in the workplace when people know you have evidence-based models that you're following to assess and to intervene with people.
Yeah, no, I think that's bang on. And for me, a lot of that is very similar. I think for the purposes of time, I'm going to focus on just ADKAR here.
Your favorite one.
Yeah, I think it really applies here. I think from a McKinsey 7S model, if I were to apply it to this, it's to understand like why my advice is not being followed. I would need to like understand whether my recommendations that are being put forward align with all of those elements of 7S. And if there is misalignment, then I need to do work in order to address. Like, for example, if my recommendation is something like, hey, I know we're operating with a skeleton crew for change management, but I'm going to need us to implement a change agent network with a bi-weekly touch point. I need to also make sure that we're having an operating committee, a steering committee in order to support this, blah, blah, blah. And that's my recommendation. But staffing is a concern because we don't have the resources in order to support that. There's misalignment there, which means I need to, well, one, recommend that we increase staffing in order to support that recommendation, or I need to scale down what it is I'm asking for to align with the conditions that we're facing. So that's how I would approach it with 7S. But from an ADKAR standpoint, and a really key element to ADKAR, because ADKAR can't just be launched in isolation. You really need to understand the people in which you're changing. And so if I'm thinking about the people that, are part of my project team, I need to think about, okay, why is my advice not being heard or listened to? And so let's go through it. Like, are people aware of the need for this change or the importance of this advice? Are they aware why this is important? Maybe they're not, because all I'm telling them is like what to do. And are they the type of people that need to know like the details Because some people are like, just do it. You know what I mean? I
Like,
don't
who
really
cares?
care.
Yeah,
You
I'll
know?
do it, whatever.
It's like, stop
It's my
telling me
job.
about it. Just do it. You don't even need to tell me, sort of thing. So you
Yeah.
just need to gauge the type of people that you're dealing with. And if they are somebody who needs to understand things before they can accept it, which is, I think, most people, then you need to make sure you're enhancing your communication strategy, providing a little bit of like, why is this important? And what are the risks? Again, not just like, why is it important to do this, but why is it important to do it because of what would happen if we don't, right? You got to look at both sides of the coin, because I think it's really hard to assess whether people are going to lean more towards or be more willing to listen to you if you tell them why you need to do something. Some people are more attracted to the idea of, oh, we need to do this because if we don't, this is going to happen.
Right. It depends on if
So-
they're like an optimist or a pessimist. Like,
Yeah,
would they
hit them
rather
with both.
understand, the negative connotation of what could happen, or do they want to know the good reasons why they should make something happen?
Yeah, so every time I'll have a recommendation, it's, okay, well, why do we want to do this? And what happens if we don't? And having both of those pieces, I think, is really important. From a desire standpoint, is there a lack of desire to support and implement my advice? And that could be a number of things. Do they lack the change maturity in order to understand the value that things are? Do they feel as though like their senior leader or the sponsor isn't aligned with the approach? And so finding what motivates them will help in me asserting my expertise and making people feel more encouraged and motivated to listen to me. And so trying to understand, what those pieces are. Then the knowledge piece, that's a big one that happens a lot. If you're dealing with an organization that is low on the change maturity side, they just might not understand what change management is all about. And so making sure that all members of the change team are actually aware of the value of change management is really important. I've seen one organization that I read in a recent case study where they put all of the project team as well as the change agents through ProSci training.
Oh, wow.
So 20 plus people went through the full training before the project launched in order to make sure that everyone understood the value of change management.
That's
And not
amazing.
from the change manager themselves, from an
Yeah.
external party. And the selection of ProSci would be strategic. There's a bunch of different places that I would recommend for training. ProSci I would recommend for very analytical thinking folks, people who like metrics and they resonate with this idea of what can't be measured can't be managed. And that's not something I said. That's from somewhere, but I just can't remember from where. But if they are an organization that aligns with that mentality, then ProSci I think is highly valuable. If you're an organization that is more focused on like agile and flexibility in terms of like how you manage projects, then Lean Change has a lot of great resources and training. And so, but finding a training that's not the change manager themselves and put them through it, I think is really important, because it will just help reinforce what the change manager is going to say. So I think that's really important. And then of course, from an ability standpoint, that's when we're thinking about this idea of, I'm going to give a recommendation, but are they actually able to implement it based on resourcing, all this stuff, similar to where the 7S model would have taken me. The 7S model is a really good way, I think, to strip down like what element is missing and what is causing their lack of ability. Is it through like systems? Is it through skills? Is it through shared value? What is it that the gap is? And so maybe that's where I would implement
would
the
come in.
7S model if ability was an area of concern. And it's just more of, it's structuring your thoughts. And that's what I like the
Yeah.
7S
Yeah.
model. You can come up with it yourself without using the model, but I think the 7S model is a really good way to identify what are the interdependent elements that you need and identifying where there may be gaps. And that's, I think, where I would use it. And then reinforcement is, I would see this more of like from a feedback loop perspective and introducing like regular check-ins to make sure that what you've recommended is actually being done.
Right.
And more so like just the act of a weekly check-in almost encourages people to do what you ask them to do, because they want to come prepared with, oh yeah, I did it and here's what happened, versus you ask them and be like, yeah,
On the spot. And
sorry,
they're
I
like,
forgot
"What?"
to do it. And then the following week, it's like, oh, sorry, I forgot to do it again. Like that act of a routine touch point almost like innately gets people to do what you've asked them to do.
Yeah.
And so that's probably how I would approach it. But you'll notice nothing specific, because at the end of the day, it really depends on the players involved. So you really need to understand who those people are, but you can see, I hope, how the framework will help identify where your area of resistance is and what you need to do next in order to essentially just make people listen to you. That's what I would do. That's what I have done, and it's been successful at least, and a reminder for me to continue to do that, honestly.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you just forget, that it's important to go through these steps in order to diagnose the issue that you're having when it comes to managing change from the project team member, the users, or yourself individually.
Because I also think with going through these different models again, like together, I think it also helps you realize if you use these kinds of tools and resources in your change management, it can actually make your job easier. If I'm talking to a patient and I'm not thinking about any of these models, I feel like it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to have that conversation with them to figure out how do we make their goal a reality? How do we make it like easier for them to make this change? But even if I'm thinking of the stages of change and where are they at, how do we get them to that next stage, let's break that down. Or even if I'm thinking about ADKAR in terms of the health behavior aspect, are they aware of why they need to make the change and why now? Is there desire there to change? Do they have the knowledge, or do I need to provide that to them? Do they have the ability to do it once they go home? And then I think with a lot of health behavior changes, that reinforcement part is really important too, because I think the example I was thinking about was the dentist. If you haven't gone in years, you get your teeth like nice and deep cleaned and everything's reset and perfect and reset for you. Now is the part where the reinforcement is really important, because if you don't go to the dentist again for a few years, it's all going to just build back up again. Yeah. You're going to be stuck back in that beginning point that you were at. But if you go to the dentist as they're scheduled for you, like every 6 months or 4 months or whatever it is they recommend to you, to maintain that change you've now made. And if you follow the recommendations and I have a dentist appointment coming up in 2 weeks, I need to remember that I need to start flossing again. Yeah. It gives you that reinforcement to keep up with that change that you've made for your oral health in this instance. But I think it applies to whether it's business change or some other health behavior change. Like having those reinforcement touch points, I think, is really important to, like we said, maintain the work you've already done. Yeah. And to keep that momentum going.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll notice apply it. The easiest way is to apply it to a personal situation, like you said, with the dentist and stuff, and see whether this works. And once you apply it personally, it's much easier to apply it on a professional setting, because you now have an understanding of what the different elements are and a tangible example of what each element is and what are the strategies in order to move some of these things forward, or identify or address rather some of the gaps that may exist in each of those elements.
Yeah.
It's cool.
I hope today's episode kind of gave all of you listening a little insight into these different models that we've presented, and maybe you've been able to think of some really good examples yourself that can help you in whatever change that maybe you're planning in your life.
This was my favorite episode by far. I'm not going to lie.
Of course it was, because you're a change manager.
This was great. I love this.
Your bread and butter.
I'm going to put this on my website, I think.
To
be like, you want to learn about what I think when it comes to change? This is it, honestly. It was a great episode. I really enjoyed it.
I think so. And if, of course, as always, if you have been listening and you have questions or comments, or you want to know a little bit more about something, or maybe how something can apply to your personal change, please reach out to us, because we would love to hear from you. You can find us on social media at Reroute Reflections, or you can even email us at podcast@reroutereflections.com. Thank you all so much for listening today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and share the podcast with a friend.
Thank you all for listening. It was great chatting again. And remember, don't be afraid to reroute.
Bye.
Bye.